It is time once again for the Scramble Podcast. Once again, I am Paul Hollingsworth in beautiful Dartmouth, Nova Scotia. My podcast broadcast partner, Chris Flynn, is in Long Lake, Quebec. Chris is a three-time Heck Crichton Award winner and a inducted member into the Canadian Football Hall of Fame. I am none of those things. And we are joined this week by Jonathan Torrens. Jonathan, welcome to the show, and we're grateful you took time to join us.
Are you kidding? I am starstruck. I'm a guy that grew up in Halifax, and Chris Flynn was a name you could drop like a credit card around town, and not unlike your own, Paul. So this is a Dear Diary moment for me to be here.
Well, you're very gracious to say that. We're thrilled to have you on our show, on our podcast. We'll get into this in a little bit, but I've always been very proud of your career and proud of the fact you come from, in large part, the same place I come from. So we'll get into that shortly. Jonathan, I wanted to, before we get into the obvious themes with you, your acting career, your performance career, your career in front of on the little screen and bigger screens, from a sports standpoint, I see the hoodie, the Oilers hoodie. You're representing well with that. I follow your social media, so I sense you have some contemporary engagement on the subject of sports. How big of a sports fan are you? How engaged are you in the things that Chris and I obsess over on a daily basis?
My love for hockey and love of broadcasting actually intertwine. I became an Oilers fan after reading Peter Zosky's book, The Game of Our Lives, not to be confused with Ken Dryden's The Game. Zosky spent a year on the bus with the upstart Oilers when they were still in, I think, the WHL in the early 80s. And it's the kind of book that's actually a treat to read now because it's like Paul Coffey might be good if he finds a bit of confidence. We'll see. Mark Messier is kind of a cocky 19-year-old, maybe not as good on talent as he was on confidence. Obviously, knowing what they went on to do was phenomenal. But I was a Zosky fan first and became an Oilers fan because it was the first book I read in my life. I'm sure you guys have these books too. That was like the first time I was reading something that was genuinely interesting to me. And became like my Bible. So I read it multiple times, and if you inhaled deeply, you could smell the hockey gear on the pages of that book. And I loved it. So I've been a lifelong Oilers fan.
That's awesome. And tell me if I'm onto something here. I had a thought as you were speaking that Chris, as a quarterback, performs on a stage. He needs to be a certain version of himself to competitively achieve in that moment. Goodness knows in my career on television, I have to engage a certain mechanism to do what I do. It's the same for you in your career. Like whatever synergies we have in the three of us in our careers and our experiences, there's a certain mechanism you have to engage in order to do what we do. Would you agree with that from an acting standpoint?
Definitely. My life by design is very quiet. My work is very social. And that's for a reason because I'm not, hey, hi, how are you, guy? In fact, if anything, I'm a little probably more shy than people might expect and retiring. I like that my life has very little to do with my job where I live. We have horses. We're out in the country. Very peaceful existence. In fact, last couple of years during the pandemic, our lives didn't change very much, which is one of the things that I actually love about where we live. The barn's the same. Going for a walk by the river is the same. And the interactions that I have with people in my neighborhood are genuine and authentic. And I always say I'm famous in my neighborhood as being the guy who doesn't know how to do a single thing for himself because everyone here barters electrical for plumbing and people have a trade. I can offer hosting. Nobody really needs that.
That's awesome. And remind us, by the way, where in the province do you live?
Just about an hour outside of Halifax between Truro and Masstown Markets, where my wife's family is from, and my kids get to see their grandparents every day, and that stuff's really important.
A beautiful part of the province, by the way. Chris, I'll bring you in on this because I'm always amazed that here's Chris this week, just for background for you, Jonathan, thrilled that he's going to meet Jonathan Torrens. We start the podcast, and Jonathan Torrens is thrilled that he's meeting Chris Flynn. Chris, it must never cease to amaze you that your career has these bump into moments a lot. I've seen a few of them over the past few months.
Yeah, for sure. And Jonathan, I don't know if you remember this, but I think I might have met you, and there was a few of you guys from the Trailer Park Boys. It was around 2008, and there was a bar across the street, I think, from the Argyle. And again, it was about 15 years ago, so you probably wouldn't remember, but I think I met a few of you guys, and one of the guys was actually the doorman at the bar too, and you guys were all hanging out, and that was again 2008. That was right in the heyday of the Trailer Park Boys. But once upon a time, I met Trevor too, another time in Halifax, but from Trailer Park Boys. But yeah, it was a while ago, but I think I might have met you once upon a time when you guys might have been.
I definitely remember.
Yeah,
I definitely remember. And in my mind's eye, when you come back to the city, red carpets are rolled out and doors are open and everyone's happy to see you. Is that your experience?
No, not at all. But if I go to if I go to St. Mary's homecoming, or they did a jersey retirement thing for me a few years ago, so that was kind of a red carpet type of day. But otherwise, it's been a long time since I played at St. Mary's, so it was yeah, it's always nice to be back there for sure.
I was thinking about how, Chris, in a way, there was the Huskies and there was Sloan. Like, those are kind of the two biggest things to come out of Halifax at the time. And in a way, you were the Sloan of university football. Like,
it's not bad.
People often ask
like
of Street Sense, did it feel cool? Yeah, well, and it's geographically appropriate. Like, you get glimpses of the Huskies around town. You'd see the odd Sloan guy having breakfast at the Ardmore or whatever. People often ask me when I was on Street Sense, did that feel cool? Because I was in high school. And the truth is, it was a show about money on CBC on Saturday morning. It wasn't Beverly Hills 90210. It didn't really feel cool. I'm guessing, being the quarterback of the St. Mary's Huskies, when you guys were banging, that must have been cool.
Yeah, no, I tell people it was almost like we were like the Halifax Huskies, and because of TSN, we were on TSN all the time. So it was kind of crazy. We were pretty big back then for sure, and it's just a blur now. But as I said, we were on TV quite a bit, and in the newspapers quite a bit. So it was kind of an exciting time in Halifax at that time. That's for sure. But I just want to mention, you've had some different characters that you've been great at. I think of like on Letterkenny and Mr. D, but for my buddies around here, of course, and you probably hear this all the time, like Trailer Park Boys, and your character was so spectacular. And my brother Patrick introduced me to Trailer Park Boys. I think 2001 was maybe the first year. And the one thing I want to mention about it is, I don't know if you ever heard this before, but when Trailer Park Boys would come on at the beginning of the show, of course, it was always sunny in Sunnyvale. And then that music would start, and I swear to God, I felt like I was drifting into Sunnyvale for the next 30 minutes. Do you know what I mean? Like, I never felt that on any other show or any movie or anything. But when that music started at the beginning of the show, it was like, wow, okay, I'm heading off to Sunnyvale for the next half an hour. And I just thought that was spectacular. And I guess that a lot of other people felt the same way. And your character, which you portrayed so amazingly, I know you've mentioned this a few times or described how this character came about, but I wanted to ask you again for our followers, how did J-Roc's character, how did that evolve or come about?
Well, it's great to be able to have this conversation with Paul here, who knows firsthand the J-Rocs that went to St. Pat's and guys that we grew up with who talked like that. It was kind of relatively early on in the existence of rap in some ways. And I don't know if you'd get away with a character like that now. It might be played out to try to introduce a character like that now. But at the time, there was the rap community, and then there was the guys that wanted to be in the rap community. And overconfident and underqualified, I always say, is the intersection of what I personally find very funny. So Mike Clattenburg went to Cole Harbor High School. When you describe that world of the music and kind of drifting into this dreamland of Sunnyvale, that's very Clattenburgian, how he would show kittens and little girls on bikes to kind of sand down the rough edges of these characters that live there. The thing that I always liked about all of the characters, J-Roc included, is that no one was ever feeling sorry for themselves. Someone asked me around the 5th or 6th season, do you feel sorry for J-Roc? And it never had occurred to me that you would. In order to play a character like that, to some degree, you can't judge it. You just have to believe that you're that guy. So thing about that universe is no one ever judged Randy and Leahy's relationship. No one ever called Bubbles disparaging words that we sometimes use in society.
This here's a story about some shit that happened to me today. Check it out. Come on. Here we go. 1, 2. Set it. But now you heard the story about how I got caught.
Which is a pretty high concept when you think about it. And no one in the park was like, what are you doing, man? Everyone was like, that's just J-Roc.
Yeah.
So Clattenburg and I and Paul went to school with these guys. Always found that patois really funny. There was always a sense of humor about it. And Mike and I worked at Street Sense on CBC. He actually had a cable show at Halifax Cable called That Damn Cable Show for years, way ahead of its time. Was doing sketch comedy and stuff like that, just taking the camera home on the weekend as you can at a cable station and learning his craft. So when he and I met at Street Sense, we started talking like these guys on the page system at the CBC Halifax building. Hey, Mike, meet me at the truck, dog. You know what I'm saying? And when he was doing the show, he said, you should play that character on the show. This was maybe fall of 99. As you said, I think it was 2000 or 2001 that the first season happened. So he asked me in the fall to do the show that was going to start in June. And I said, sure. And in January, I was in a bad car accident on the 101, broke my femur in 5 places. And I kind of came to in a wheelchair for a couple of months, really bad break, steel rod from my hip to my knee with 2 screws at either end, like DeWalt drills. It was bad.
Jeez.
Graduated to crutches. It's getting to be March and April. May, finally, I'm walking with a cane. And I called Clattenburg and said, I can't do the show, man. He said, why? I said, well, I'm walking with a cane. Every scene I'm going to have to be sitting down or propped up against a wall or something. I can't walk without it. And he said, just rock it. That's why J-Roc has the cane in the first season of Trailer Park, because I physically couldn't walk without it.
You actually needed one.
And it actually needed it. And the people that watched the show were like, oh, good choice. That's a little pimp cane. That's really funny. But I almost said no, because I thought there's no way I could pull the character off. So
wow.
Clattenburg again to the rescue, saying, man, that's fine. Nobody cares.
It's funny, Jonathan, coming out of my Oxford school, St. Pat's High School, as you were saying that, I know 15 guys that I could describe the way you're describing them, and I still know them around town. I love these guys. They're authentic. They're real. They're part of the neighborhood. And you had the genius to do what you did with them. I just enjoyed them from an entertainment standpoint because they made my childhood and adolescence interesting. But I guess it speaks to the neighborhoods we live in, filled with fascinating characters who influence us and in some cases we stay our friends for many decades.
Definitely. And guys that grew up pretty close to the bone. There was always sort of this misconception that the people in French immersion had more. I certainly didn't have a lot. I remember Freeman's across the street from St. Pat's. Do you know that reference, Chris? Freeman's Little New York on Quinpool Road. It's a pizza joint. It's open late. They serve booze.
Yes, I remember it. Yeah.
Still there.
Okay. Wow.
And in those days, Freeman was actually there, who was kind of a Italian mob-looking character. And he was just another flavor in the neighborhood. And, you know, he could tell maybe some days I didn't have cash and he'd slide me a slice of pizza. Like that was just kind of our universe at that time. And our world was very small. But again, none of the guys we went to school with were feeling sorry for themselves either.
Yeah. And I'll add to this, growing up in my neighborhood, there was a list of 6 or 7 guys that because they were your friends, I didn't have to worry too much about some things because I knew these guys were always looking out for me if the rubber hit the road, which falls under the category of good friends to have. Jonathan, I want to touch on the St. Pat's Street Sense. So for our listeners, for our viewers, Jonathan and I overlapped by 1 year at St. Pat's High School. My last year there was your first year there, and you were on Street Sense. You were a high school student who had a job on TV. I could unpack that all night when it comes to how fascinated I am by that. How did that happen? Did you have the acting gene young? Do you come from an artistic family? Like, how does a guy in grade 10 at St. Pat's High School get a TV gig like that?
It's a great question. And I don't think anyone that knew me my whole life was very surprised that this ended up becoming my path. I was in a play in grade 1 called The Rabbit Who Wanted Red Wings. I played the rabbit. So the legend goes, during intermission, there were some parents saying that kid could write his own ticket. Like the signs were kind of there. But truthfully, I did a musical at St. Pat's called Joseph and the Amazing Technicolor Dreamcoat. Had a pretty flashy part in that musical. And John Nowlin, who would be the executive producer of Street Sense, called the school, left a message and said, would he audition for this new show that we're doing? So because I hadn't really given any consideration to what my career would be, I was working at McDonald's on Quimple Road at the time. You got a free meal with every shift, and sometimes I'd slip away from school and go grab a free lunch for a 3-hour shift. I was just kind of searching for any kind of rock in the ocean. And the interesting thing is, ended up on the show, and then I wanted to go to Ryerson to study RTA, Radio and Television Arts. And there was a registrar there who said, why? You're working in the business. Don't come here. Just pay attention where you are. Our graduates would love to have your job. So I've never gone to post-secondary education. I've just always had my head down and kept the grind going.
Wow.
And it's the work, isn't it? It's the effort and the work. I talk to people in the business on the journalism side, the entertainment side, big actors, smaller bit actors. It's a grind. You really have to hit it hard for long periods of time to make it happen, don't you?
You do, yeah. There's in typical Canadian fashion, if you've had a high profile role here, people are like, well, you've had your chance. It's someone else's turn. So you can't just exclusively say, I'm a sitcom actor in Canada. There just isn't enough work. And I found that out when I went to the States with my Swiss Army knife approach in Canada. I write a bit, direct a bit, produce a bit, have a side hustle, because if I tried to do any one of those things, it wouldn't be enough. When I went to the States, they said, are you a sitcom guy or are you a host? Because you can't be both, which was really new information to me. In Canada, you can, and in fact, have to be.
Wow. Tell us about Jonavision. Jonavision is one of the, I don't want to say a forgotten chapter in your career, but you've had, like, Trailer Park Boys to me is such a big splash that it causes me sometimes to forget about Jonavision. Those years for you were what when it comes to artistically formative? How important were they?
I was on Street Sense for 7 years, and I did, believe it or not, a network special for CBC about AIDS for teenagers called AIDS Care. It was a sketch comedy show about the myths surrounding AIDS, which, saying it out loud, just sounds like bananas. But it was kind of the first wave of this infotainment, Street Sensey, like mix comedy with fact and spoonful of sugar to make the medicine go down. So Jonavision was sometimes a game show, sometimes a sketch show, sometimes a talk show, sometimes a battle of the bands. And it was formative in that most of the things I've done since have been hybrids in some way. Trailer Park Boys is a mockumentary. I did a show called The Joe Schmo Show, which was a fake reality show. I've always liked, it seems like this, but with a side salad of this, kind of makes it more interesting to work on. So I was really lucky to have that platform. And I, like you, Paul, really believe in the power of broadcasting, and especially at that time, pre-internet, when if you lived in Plaster Rock, New Brunswick, the only way to see what kids in Toronto were wearing or listening to was either wait for a magazine to be delivered once a month or watch TV. So the interesting thing about at that time was there were a few channels and most shows had to appeal to everyone.
But the podcast, things have changed.
Yeah, because you can court a micro audience. You can have the 1990 SMU Huskies football team podcast, and everyone who was on it or loved it will be like, have you heard it? It's the best podcast out there. You can go micro as opposed to macro. You don't have to be all things to all people.
I want to add one question to this. I tell you a bit of a story and sort of flip into a question from it. Then I'll let Chris weigh in on a couple of things. I golfed with Ricky and Julian from the Trailer Park Boys in 2002 at the old Digby Classic Golf Tournament. We were, quote, celebrities. We'll put quotes around me because those guys were big dogs and I was along for the ride. So I hung with them for the weekend. Great time. I could tell you stories about that weekend forever. And about a year or two later, I bumped into Ricky and Julian. They were shooting an episode of Trailer Park Boys in downtown Halifax, and they saw me between takes, and they stayed in character and started heckling me as I walked by. And Jonathan, it was the best 3 minutes of my life. It was so much fun just to be on the receive. They might not even remember it. But I guess when it comes to the performance, is that common? Because they were having fun with me, but they were staying almost from a method standpoint, staying in character, and I could see them doing it. Is that something you do? Is that common in the business, or does it truly vary from actor to actor?
I would say it varies from actor to actor. I know the last few seasons I worked on the show that were shooting in Truro, and there was 7 minutes between being J-Roc and being dad at the dinner table. That's a pretty hard page turn to not call your children motherfuckers when you're coming in hot from work, which I think is a struggle that anyone who works and tries to be a parent and strike that balance goes through. But particularly hard when you're playing a fake rapper on TV and then trying to be dad. Those guys are phenomenal at those characters. Ricky, Rob Wells makes me laugh really hard because he's so earnest and his face is so open, and just the way he can say, like, I thought God was Santa Claus. I thought they were the same thing. I thought God just got dressed up as Santa Claus every year. Like, that's so dumb. It's genius, and he can say it with such a sincerity that I've scarring on my cheeks permanently from trying not to laugh, like biting my cheeks during takes.
That's awesome. Now, Chris, you have some questions you wanted to share with Jonathan from viewers. We and the backstory to this is, Jonathan, Chris and I are really excited to have you on. Other people that we know were also excited to have you on. So Chris has a couple of questions that he wanted to feed you just from people that he knows in his world. Chris.
Okay.
Nice.
Yeah. So the first question, Jonathan, is whose idea was it to make the J-Roc references in Mr. D?
Oh, good question. That's good. Good. Yes.
Great question. It was the crossover episode that no one asked for. I think one of the things that's allowed me to have a career versus just a role is trying to figure out when to say when and when to walk away. It's as a freelancer, kind of counterintuitive to leave a job. But I think the audiences are sophisticated and people can sense when you're kind of done with something. So I've been really lucky. Trailer Park Boys came along kind of at the end of John Vision. Mr. D came along kind of at the end of Trailer Park Boys. But as we've seen, it's the cockroach of Canadian comedy. It's a show that won't die and keeps finding new life on Netflix. And now it's in every territory in the world. And we'll get messages from teenage boys in Norway saying they love Trailer Park Boys. So Mike Volpe, former St. Mary's goaltender.
Yes, I know.
Who went to New York Islanders camp.
Good friend. Yeah, good friend of mine as well. Yeah.
Yeah, we went to St. Mary's at the same time.
Yeah, great dude.
Yes.
Yeah. So not another goalie become lawyer, become TV producer story. It's a little cliche. Mike produced Trailer Park Boys and Mr. D. So he might have been the one that would have generated that little tip of the hat, the J-Roc hat.
Okay,
on
awesome.
Mr. D.
Okay. Second question from my buddy Gabe. It might be a tough question. He says, what is your favorite episode in Trailer Park Boys?
Ooh. That's so hard. Because in later seasons, I directed episodes, which was really a fun challenge. People probably don't realize how much consideration goes into upholding the premise. For example, it's a fake documentary. So if the guys are breaking into a bank, technically, given the premise, the camera should follow them into the bank. But sometimes cinematically, it's a better shot if the camera's in the bank, low angle, looking up at the window as they break through and step over it. So I kind of have a fondness for the later seasons from a creative standpoint, because it was fun to actually grab the wheel and try to make some of those decisions. The other word I came up with was panticipate. So if it's actually a documentary and Chris is talking, the camera shouldn't pan to Paul before he starts speaking, because that feels fake. But if Paul starts speaking and the camera reacts to the action as it's happening, that feels much more authentic. So creatively, it was really fun to get to try to execute the aesthetic of the show, especially something people might not consider. As cameras and phones get better, it's harder to make something that looks poor quality.
Mm-hmm.
So even making Trailer Park Boys look as bad as it needs to in later seasons was a challenge. But affectionately, early on, the first couple of seasons when we didn't know what lightning in a bottle we had, we brought sandwiches from home and we're sitting on Coleman coolers between takes, making each other laugh. Those are the ones that will always be the most special because it felt so Dartmouth. It felt like I can't imagine anyone, even in Pictou County or New Brunswick, would get this. It felt so hyper local. So it was inconceivable and really exciting to watch it travel. But it was bands like The Hip, Rush, Our Lady Peace that shared the DVDs, sports teams too, like gassing up beside each other. Like, have you guys seen this? That was the grassroots way the show caught fire because it was really confusing to people when it started on Showcase.
Yeah, like I remember the first episode. For a lot of people, when you watch the first episode, you're like, what the hell is this? And then you watch it a couple episodes, and then
it doesn't make sense.
And I remember it was on Thursday nights on Showcase, and man, it was kind of like Seinfeld in the 90s. Like, you did not want to miss an episode. You weren't recording back then. You were just waiting for that show to come on Thursday nights, and that, the music to come on at the beginning of the show. It was awesome. All of a sudden, that's like 20 years ago, which is crazy. But I got one more question for you.
Crazy. And I always tell people you have to watch 3 episodes before you make a judgment. Because if you just watch one, you're like, this is garbage. The second one, you're like, this is stupid. And after the third one, you're like, what's going to happen next?
Yes. And there are people who did watch just an episode and then didn't watch it again. But most people, as you said, did give it a chance. And wow, you get hooked on it pretty fast. By the way, we had a neighbor, Mr. Leahy, and one of the first episodes, like, I actually had a real neighbor, Mr. Leahy in Buckingham. And one of the first episodes was, Mr. Leahy is a drunken bastard or something like that. So my dad thought that was really weird from, we had a
Incidentally,
neighbor.
Was your neighbor, Mr. Leahy, a drunken bastard?
No, he wasn't at all. He was the principal at the high school.
Yeah. All the more reason it's funny. Yes. Paul, did you ever cross paths with John Dunsworth?
I know. Yes, I did the Feeding Others of Dartmouth Christmas fundraiser many years ago, and he was there for one night. And great guy, obviously, very, very good guy, very talented guy. That was it was a while ago now. That's Mike Savage's family, Margaret Savage, their charity in downtown Dartmouth. So he was involved in that. So I did meet him that night. Yes.
If you relate things to sports, and if your Trailer Park Boys team was a sports team, he was like the veteran. It seemed like the veteran on your team, right? Like almost like the captain of your team. It felt like.
Yeah, and speaking of like fourth line grinders, there's a guy who was working in theater since the 50s and had 4 kids and raised his family, and times were tight. And he was a casting director in Halifax and worked as an artist for art's sake. And he really understood what lightning in a bottle it was. He was really the actor's actor who came prepared and was fearless and set the tone and the bar for all of us. But he also, as the show got popular, was accosted a lot, as you might expect, in public, but he just loved it. People would pull up next to him at stoplights and yell, "F you, Leahy," and he would just like let it wash over him. He just loved it, man. By the way, he didn't drink.
I know. I actually, when they were doing a tour with Randy all around, they would be in Ottawa sometimes, and I almost got him, and I call him Randy, I almost got them here at my bar to do a little thing here because we were half an hour away, but it just didn't happen. That was about 10 years ago, but that would have been but I remember him telling me that, saying, Chris, you guys are all going to have me over, but I just want to let you know I don't actually drink. And I said, oh, that's okay, but that just says what a great actor he was, because you just imagine that he must have drank, right? Because it was
his whole thing is, when people are actually drunk, they're not falling down all over the place. They're trying to keep it together, which makes the moments when the wheels come off the bus and they do fall over that much more funny. So he played the whole thing like right here, and it just created so much suspense because it's coming, but it's just interesting to see how it's going to happen.
Yeah.
But
even that
genius comedian, and
even that car that he drove around Sunnyvale was pretty funny too. But okay, last question for you. This is from my buddy Corey, not Corey from Trailer Park Boys, but my buddy Corey. And it's more of a joke than a question, but he wants to know, will J-Roc ever get back into directing porn movies again?
Well, I'm trying to remember what it was called, From Russia with the Love Bone or something. I was in
yes, with
early
Bubbles. That was in the early days with Bubbles. He was kind of shy even. Yeah.
And Ricky was soft serve, I think, because he wasn't able to deliver.
Yes.
Remember, I think it was Bubbles saying you can't play pool with a rope. I think that was the line.
And Trevor said there was technical difficulties with Ricky. Yeah.
Yeah. It's true. Bubbles did evolve between the early seasons and the later seasons. It's kind of an interesting challenge to write a show like that, because obviously Bubbles is a breakout character after the first season or two, and the temptation in the writer's room is to create more opportunities to have that character in the show. But as you get into like season 7, 8, and 9, when you take the guys out of the park, people don't like that. When you bring new characters in, people don't like that. And when you revisit some of the same types of interactions, people are like, man, what else you got? But Clattenburg always had that genius. Mike Volpe called it pixie dust, where we'd shoot a scene where Ricky and Randy are kind of bickering. And Mike would say, that was good. Let's do it again. But Randy has a bag of sour cream and onion chips, and Ricky's trying to get them from him the whole time. So same words, same movement, but just that extra added layer of two guys bickering over a bag of chips just made it next level.
Beautiful. Yeah.
It's amazing. I have some questions for you, and first one, we'll go back to St. Pat's High School. You tell me yours, I'll tell you mine. Your favorite teacher at St. Pat's High School was whom?
I had a biology teacher named Earl Sampson. Do you remember him, Mr. Sampson? I liked him a lot. But for some reason, I texted you this today. Joe Dulong popped into my head. There were a couple of vice principals that were really cool. Yeah. Mr. McSweeney grew up in the hood, right? Yeah. Mm-hmm. McSweeney grew up like blocks from the school, and he was very much of the neighborhood. And I love
very good
dudes.
Guy.
How about you?
But well, Mr. McSweeney is a difference maker in my life. We all have these role models that we look up to who show you the way. He's on that list for me going back to high school, vice principal at St. Pat's High School. Mr. Kirk, who also coached football for Chris Flynn with Chris Flynn at St. Mary's University. He was our gym teacher and our football coach. I go to the gym every day and exercise every day because of Mr. Kirk. I hear his voice in my ear telling me to try hard every day. It's funny how those things stay with you. And the other two I'll mention would be, I went on to get a Bachelor of Arts in English at St. Mary's University. My first degree was in English. And so Mr. Wallace, my English teacher, and Mrs. McDonald, great people. I wish I could go back to school and be more mature in their classes, go back in time, be more mature in their classes and apply myself, because I value their influence on me so much as a 53-year-old. But I was such a clown in their class that I have guilt about it. But that's the experience of going back and looking at your high school years.
My mother in junior high said we might as well eliminate the middleman and you can go to your own parent-teacher interviews. So I sat down across from my teachers like, so Dan, how am I doing in math? And every single one said the same exact thing. You're a nice enough guy, but why do you have to ruin it for everyone? So I do have a general layer of sheepishness about my entire school journey, knowing I was disruptive, knowing I was probably rude and a little cocky. Luckily, I had a lot of surrogate parents that were camera operators and crew people at CBC who straightened me right out. Yeah. So any of that buying my own hype stuff, by the time I was 18, I'd sort of worked out of my system. Chris, how did you keep your head together and your feet on the ground with as much attention as you got in those years?
Oh, I was kind of like you. I was actually kind of shy in a way and reserved, especially in high school and CJEP, which is kind of like junior college. I didn't drink either really till, in university days I did, but I was pretty shy, even though I was the quarterback of the football team. I was pretty shy in my high school days and that. But it's funny. So you were kind of like the class clown, would you say, in high school?
I think that's fair.
And did you mimic actors and characters like, like say the J-Roc character? Did you do that with all kinds of people and actors that you would come across, kind of just start mimicking those people that you came across in your life?
Definitely. And I've done that my whole life. I see it in my kids now. They do it as well. And Kids in the Hall came out probably a couple of years before I was at St. Pat. Probably like kind of junior high years for me.
Yeah.
And that was the first show that blew my mind. I felt like I spoke this secret language, but I'd never seen anyone else speak it before. Obviously, they were doing it at a much higher level. But that really rang my bell. So just to know there were other people out there playing weird characters and stuff like that. But that's why I love living where I do, because I can collect and gather strange tics and verbal things, and from the people that I come across in my real life, I can steal things from them to use in characters. Like we were in San Diego a couple of years ago. There was a pool cleaner who got in his late 50s, bleach blonde hair, just like picking French fries out of the pool and lived to surf every morning, man. Like, I love that guy. I'll be using that somewhere. There's a guy in my neighborhood who always almost has to burp. Like, hey, what are you guys up to? I haven't used it yet, but that's something I'm definitely going to use somewhere. But sometimes I play characters I have no reference for, like Noah Dick in Letterkenny. The Mennonite guy, this was very much Jared Kiso's creation. He grew up in Listowel, Ontario. Lots of Mennonites around. And for some reason in that part of the world, they say once at the end of sentences. And there are some different theories as to where that came from. So to kind of figure out the rhythm and cadence of a character like that was a bit of a challenge, especially because Letterkenny, they shoot a big wide shot of like a 7-page scene at the vegetable stand, which is pretty uncommon in TV. You kind of tend to junk it up. So as you get to page 4 and 5 of a single take, you're just thinking, man, please don't be the guy that blows it. So we have to go back to the start. They perform at a real high level.
Okay. I got a buddy, Jesse Carling. He reminds me of you. I'm going to try to have him on the show one of these days. If I do, I'll let you know about that episode. You might see a little bit of himself in you. He was the class clown all through school, and he's great at doing characters, mimicking, even doing a Jean Chrétien, that type of thing. And like he's pretty good. So I'll let you know when he might be on the show in the future. you might enjoy it. Yeah.
Last question from me, and then I'll give Chris the final word before we start to wrap up here. The fact that you're in Nova Scotia, everyone has a story, Jonathan. I love that part of your story, because we know from the Maritimes standpoint, people, when they become successful, often leave. But you're back. You're living here. You're not in New York. You're not on the West Coast. I think that's a great part of your story. Did that just happen? Did you try to leave? You mentioned a while ago about, when you went to the US, they were trying to slot you certain ways. But did you always know you were going to stay, or did your path bring you back here?
I have never been someone who has a plan that they're trying to execute. It's hard to do in this business. I know I turned 30 and I'd been at CBC for 15 years. So there was a reluctance at that building to accept that I could do a show as a grown-up, because I was always kind of teen guy. So went to LA of self-imposed exile as much as anything. And to answer the what if question, what would happen if I went there? Made friends for life. Didn't expect that. Worked plenty, which was nice, on some things that I'm proud of and some things that were okay. But also auditioned for a lot of garbage. Like, fame was never something that motivated me as far as my journey there. Like the sleeping on a friend's couch just to make it. Didn't care. I already had a pretty good career here. So I was coming back from a garbage audition for a casino. And I called my mom back in Halifax and said, what are you up to? And she said, I'm going to the dentist. I could tell she was kind of blue, didn't want to go to the dentist by herself. And it was just a light bulb moment. At the end of my life, do I want to be the guy that drove his mom to the dentist? Or do I want to be a guy who did a shitty casino commercial? And when you put it like that, it's a pretty simple question. also, when I lived there, you're so reluctant on your manager to talk to your agent, to talk to a casting director, to talk to a producer to see if they've heard from the director. Here, I can just generate my own opportunities. So I came back with a renewed vigor and excitement to live here. Matthew McConaughey talks about green lights. I met Carol, who's now my wife. We had 2 little girls. It all just kind of happened. It was the moment that things that used to be suffocating and limiting about here were suddenly comforting and familiar. And when that happens, there's nowhere else you'd rather. I'm sure you have the same story.
Oh, well, I do. I could have left. I mean, look, I'm not going to compare my career to yours, but I have a career that usually when you succeed, you should leave. So I had the TSN Toronto thing pulling at me quite a bit. And I never wanted to leave. You know, there's a line from A River Runs Through It, the Norman MacLean story, and Brad Pitt and Craig Schiffer, the 2 actors. And Craig Schiffer lives in he lives in Chicago. And he says to his Brad Pitt brother, he says, "Why don't you come live in Chicago?" And Brad Pitt's character says, "No, brother, I'm from Montana. I'm always going to stay in Montana." I've always had that in me. Like I could have left a couple of times. I don't know if I would have succeeded more or made much more money or had anything more to be proud of. But I've always been a bit of a homeboy. I always knew I was going to stay. Pulled away a couple of times, but no, I planted my flag a long time ago, and I'm proud of that decision. In a life filled with many mediocre decisions, Jonathan, the fact that I planted my flag and I stayed in Nova Scotia, I'm proud of that one. I'm proud of that one for sure.
Well, I'll tell you, as a fan, it was always a real kick to see you doing the TSN thing. It was always a source of pride for me too to see you excel in your corner of the broadcast universe and know that we came from the same place. That was always really cool.
Well, you're very kind to say that, and it lands so well with me. I can tell you, and I was telling Chris over the past couple of weeks, I'm proud of you. Like you, everyone has a story. Your story is awesome. And again, we come from the same place. You've succeeded so well. You're enormously talented. Just listening to you talk about ripping off little pieces of people that you meet, the people that you meet each day, and bringing it to your acting method, that's the work of a genius. So I get such a kick out of watching you do your thing. And to think that you would take time to join us today, it means everything. And Chris, I know you were looking forward to this as well.
Yeah, for sure, Jonathan. Is definitely we've been talking about this for a few weeks. Definitely a thrill to have you on the show today. And my friends and followers definitely know most of your characters. But I guess if they could ask, they'd say, how would if J-Roc was signing off right now, how would he sign off on the show to all the guests?
He'd probably have to say something like, "I didn't see Monkey and P unit. I'm out like Crocs, bitches. Swoop. Peace."
Beautiful. It is perfect. Awesome. Listen, Jonathan, thank you so much for doing this. Let's do it again. We actually saw you on the High Button podcast, and we thought we had this great original idea to have you on our podcast. And the High Button guys, who do a great job, had you on as well. So you've been doing the podcast circuit. Yeah, I know, but it's great. They were great with you too, and we're so grateful for joining us. So thank you for doing this, and make sure you come back and see us again sometime. Okay.
I would love that, and I will confess, after doing the High Button one, I was like, I'm out of stories. I'm gonna take a break. I have nothing interesting to share, nothing new to say. And then I get a message from you, and I'm like, well, how do I say no to those two? So it was a real kick for me too. Appreciate you.
Loved every moment of it. That wraps up another episode of the Scramble Podcast. For Chris Flynn, I'm Paul Hollingsworth. We thank Jonathan Torrens for joining us. We're thrilled he joined us, and we will see you next time.